Hi guys, today we're going to talk about all the books that I read in December. This is coming at you a little later than I had hoped. I got sick right after the holidays, so the last bit of December was basically a wash, but I was able to get some reading in. If you remember from my December TBR, one of my goals for this month was to read a lot of arcs, and I'm happy to report that I did do just that. So starting off with Heart of the Sun Warrior by Sue Lynn Tan. I actually did read most of this at the end of November, but I did finish it December 2nd, so I didn't talk about it in my November wrap-up. But this is the anticipated sequel of Daughter of the Moon Goddess that came out earlier last year, and I loved Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I gave that 5 stars. I thought it was such a rich and imaginative world, and unfortunately I didn't love its sequel quite as much, but it was a continuation of a fun adventure. My main 2 issues with this one were I didn't care for the villain. I thought that they came out of kind of left field and didn't really see the point of them. And then I thought a lot of things just kind of wrapped up a little too nicely and easily. In particular, there was one character where I was just expecting this plot twist coming with them basically for the entire book, but instead they were sort of just there. Like, I don't know, it was nice, but I didn't quite get the point. And maybe that's just me sort of looking for clues where there aren't any or expecting the worst. It is nice to have sort of happy things happen in a book like this, but maybe it was just the timing of it or what. It just felt off to me, so I did enjoy the continuation of the adventure and the characters. There's a love triangle in this story that I really had a lot of fun reading about, but if that's not your thing, that might be kind of a detriment to the story for you. But yeah, I gave this one 3 stars. It was okay. I didn't hate it, but I definitely had frustrations with it. I'm currently waiting on my Fairy Loot copy to come in, so unfortunately I don't have it here with me, but this was an arc that I received. I just read it a little bit later than I intended to. Then I read a bit of City of Dusk by Tara Sim. This is also the Fairy Loot edition, but unfortunately I did DNF this one. I am trying to be kinder to myself in that regard and put books down that just I feel like I'm tolerating more than enjoying, and I gave this one about 100 pages, but it just was not for me, unfortunately. I thought the world building was really messy, and the writing had a lot of like anachronisms that just really distracted me. It's a fantasy world, but you had a lot of like really modern turns of phrase that felt out of place, or like random like French words that would come in, but like with no explanation as to why there are like French influences in this world. It was very strange. I don't know. That feels kind of nitpicky, but the plot just wasn't coming together for me. I didn't care about any of the characters. You're constantly jumping back and forth between I believe it's like 4 or 5 main characters who are all like representatives of different houses that worship these different gods. Like, it was a really cool premise where you had these houses basically that all derived this divine power from a different source, but they're like, I believe the realms that connect them to their gods were disconnected at some point, and now the city is facing severe repercussions from that, like economically, and I don't know, I didn't care. That was the biggest problem for this. So unfortunately, I DNF'd this one and will not be continuing with the series. And I have such a hard time DNFing books in the first place, but this was also an arc that I had received earlier this year and just didn't get around to before publishing. So I feel really bad DNFing arcs, but I feel like a DNF is kind of a review in of itself. So yeah, this one didn't do it for me, and I didn't rate it. Then I picked up an arc for the novella The Crane Husband by Kelly Barnhill. This comes out in February of this year, so this felt good to get ahead on an arc for once. I haven't been great about that, but I figured with novellas, I could definitely knock it out in time. And this one is a retelling of the story about the crane wife, in which a man turns a literal crane into a woman to be a wife for him. This crane wife is really gifted on the loom and helps him create a really prosperous business. And eventually he just demands more and more out of this crane before she's finally like, peace out, I'm over this, bye. So this was sort of a flip on that. Instead of a woman, it's a man, who comes into this house, and he's kind of monstrous, actually. It feels like a very large allegory for like an abusive person. The mother of this family becomes obsessed with this man and starts to neglect her children, and our main character is one of these kids. This child is forced to basically raise her baby brother and deal with this new intrusive abusive person in their life. It was strange. There are moments where this person is actually a literal crane, and then they also turn into a man at certain points, I think during the night, and it's a very literal take on the story. Like as a retelling. This novella does have some interesting elements and plot points for me, but overall it just didn't feel quite developed enough for me to feel really invested, and that's the hard part about a novella, I suppose. I like a really quick and snappy story that I can bust out in one sitting, but this one just wasn't quite as engaging to me as other ones have been, so for that reason, I gave it 3 stars. It's an interesting take on a retelling, but not my favorite thing that I've ever read, and I don't think it'll really, like, stick with me very long. Then I picked up A Fire Endless by Rebecca Ross. This is the sequel and the end of a duology by her, the first one being A River Enchanted. I think the duology is called The Elements of Cadence, which is very fitting. And this is just like a beautiful, lyrical, like just lovely story. The first one we follow Jack, who is a musician, he's a bard, and he's returning to his homeland of Cadence for the first time in years. Cadence is a very mystical, magical place that's very influenced by these like elemental fae, and the relationship that these people have with the land is so interesting and enchanting. He feels a lot of anxiety about returning because his childhood was sort of plagued with concerns about who his father is, and he also butted heads a lot with the laird's daughter, who is set to inherit the lairdship herself. But when he comes back, he finds his relationship with Adara, the laird's daughter, to be quite improved, and they work together to solve this mystery about these missing girls on the island. And this is a very like close-knit small community, so everybody knows everybody, and there's also this other clan on the island that they are like physically separated from. There's this barrier in between the two, and they just like do not get along. So there's a lot of sort of balls up in the air, but it just unfolds in this really beautiful way, and the writing is gorgeous. The element of like music and its place in this world is also really cool, and I just loved reading about these characters. And even more than Jack and Adara, I loved reading about Torin and Sidra, who are this older couple. I don't know, I think the inclusion of them as main characters just really did this story a lot of justice. They bring so much like nuance about love into the story, where I feel like we read a lot of fantasy books about a newly forming love. This one is about a relationship that has been through its ups and downs. The contribution of that to the story was just absolutely beautiful. So I can't really talk too much about what this one is about without spoiling the first one, but I did give it 5 stars. It was a great continuation and wrap up. Sort of similarly to Heart of the Sun Warrior, there were a couple things that I thought wrapped up a little too nicely, but it felt a little bit more fitting in this one. I just love Rebecca Ross's writing. I can't wait for her new book this next year, Divine Rivals, and I want to go through her backlist and pick some stuff up because I was just so enchanted by this duology, and this was a great ending to it. Then I picked up another arc for a novella coming out this year, and this time in January, and that is Lost in the Moment and Found by Shannon Maguire. This is, I believe, the 8th book in the Wayward Children series, and it is one of my favorites so far. I think I kind of have an unpopular opinion in that I really enjoy the stories that are sort of one-offs. The main series overall kind of follows a core group of children who are at Eleanor West's home for wayward children, and sort of mysteries that they have to solve along the way as they're dealing with being back in the real world after going off into their portal worlds and coming back to reality. But I really enjoyed the one-off books that follow a single child through their doorway and learning about that world and why they're suited to it, and the things that that world reveals about certain elements that pertain to the series as a whole. And this one really captured all of that. This one follows Ancy, who, when she was very young, lost a series of very important things to her in very rapid succession. And I will say that there are some trigger warnings for grooming and gaslighting in the very beginning of this book, if that's something that you have a hard time reading about. But she runs away from this bad situation, and she finds herself going through a door that leads her into basically every thrift shopper's dream. It's like a junk house, and it's just endless, basically. And she finds that this world is the home to things that have been lost. And sometimes people will come looking for that thing that they've lost, but other times they're kind of lost for good, and they're able to sell some of this stuff or collect other things from other worlds. Nancy finds that she has the ability to open doors into different worlds, and they're able to visit markets and stuff there. It's all very cool. I thought the world itself was really atmospheric. There is a talking magpie who, like, this is the home of magpies. They just, like, collect these things, and it's great. I loved Nancy. I loved her story, and I thought this book in particular revealed things about the doors itself, or themselves, that I just thought was super interesting. So highly recommend if you've read any of the Wayward Children's books and liked them. I thought this one was a really just standout book in that series, so I gave it 5 stars. Then I picked up Little Eve by Catriona Ward, which is not the most mood-ready book for December right before Christmas, but this was also an arc that I had received a NetGalley and just hadn't read in time, but I was committed to getting through these arcs. So I requested this one because I loved The Last House on Needless Street a lot, like many other people did, and I guess this is a re-release of her debut novel, which was interesting. I did not know that beforehand. I think someone in my comments for my December TBR mentioned that, so thank you. And this was interesting. If you're at all interested in cults, in sort of the power dynamics in cults, I definitely recommend you pick this up. It was a really interesting, I don't want to say case study, but introspective look into that. We follow this weird little family that lives on this, it's kind of an island, but like depending on when the tide comes in, it's either connected to the mainland or it's not. They're in Scotland. And so in the town that is nearest to this little island, there's a lot of rumors and gossip about this family, and they're definitely very much outsiders. One day, the local butcher is making a delivery to this family and finds them all murdered in like a ritualistic killing, except for one person. And the events of that night are led up to throughout the course of this novel, and it was bizarre. I do think the mystery in this one was a little more obvious than The Last House on Needless Street, but I don't know. Maybe not. I guessed it kind of early, but that's not to say this wasn't enjoyable. This was definitely really gothic, atmospheric vibes, but there is a lot of child abuse and neglect involved in this book. It's also really hard to read about these characters who are just super invested in this ideology that keeps this cult together. It is so bizarre and harmful. It was hard to read about for sure. This is not the kind of thing I typically reach for, so maybe if you're a little bit more used to that, it won't be quite as difficult to read about, but I did think it was interesting. I believe I gave this 3.5 stars. Let me check. I gave it 3 stars. Okay. Not my favorite by Catriona Ward, but it was interesting. And I think maybe if I had read it at kind of more of like a spooky time of year, I probably would have liked it more. This definitely has gothic vibes. It has like murder mystery vibes. It's all there. I just think maybe I wasn't quite in the mood for it, but I finished it. So yeah. This next book is the cozy, historical, fae fantasy of my dreams. It just checked all my boxes, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This was also an arc that I received, but I did happen to get the Fairy Loot edition of it in December, which I absolutely love. I think the edges are gorgeous. The end papers with the character art, like, I read this book before I received it. This is exactly how I pictured these characters. It's a little freaky, to be honest. But yeah, I absolutely loved this one. And in this one, we follow a sort of curmudgeonly professor, Emily Wilde, who is pretty much the foremost expert in her field on fairies in Europe. In this one, she is going to a very sort of off the radar country. It's called like Losland, I think. It's very wintry. It kind of gives like Norway vibes. I'm not sure if it's an island though, so it's not Scandinavia, but it has that vibe to it. And she arrives in this small town to study the lost ones, who are like very elusive fae. Even the locals haven't really seen many of them, but they're very wary of them. She is later joined by her colleague Wendell Brambleby. Sort of together they unravel these mysteries about these local fae and mysteries about Wendell himself. So I just thought this was so fun. I loved this sort of grumpy sunshine dynamic between Emily and Wendell. Emily is very much an introvert and is very dedicated to her studies, whereas Wendell is a people person and would rather not do the academic work, but they make a really good team, even though they like should not get along at all. Their interests in the fae and like how they differ and their motivations are really interesting to read about. I love the fae in this book. You have a really good spectrum of like these sort of low fae, like brownie type characters, and then you also have these high fae, courtly, schemy, evil characters. Just the way that Heather Fawcett writes about them is just my favorite way that fae are depicted in modern fiction. I just think they're so fun and wicked and schemy, and I love following the cunning humans who have to find their way out of these fae plots. So this was so much fun. It's a very like slow burn kind of romance as well, which I love. It's the first one in a series. I cannot wait for the second one. I am very much anticipating that. I don't know if that's going to come out this year or next year or what, but as soon as that hits NetGalley, I am requesting it because I thought this book was so charming and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Then I picked up The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah, and this is another arc that I requested, and it's been out since like May or June now, and I'm just very behind. But this was a lot of fun. This initially gave me very similar vibes as We Hunt the Flames by Hafsa Faisal. You have a kind of similar setup where you have this main protagonist who is very good at finding things, and this prince outcast character who has to help this person. Together they go on this journey into the desert to find a thing. And beyond that, though, the similarities kind of end. I thought the characters in this one were actually much more engaging. I had a lot of fun with the multi-POV in this one. The main character, Luli, is really interesting. She has this double persona, like the Midnight Merchant, who hunts down these jinn relics, kind of the fae of the Middle East, who hunts down jinn relics with her jinn partner and sells them at an incredible value in this illegal market. And she's eventually recruited by the Sultan to go looking for this lamp, basically, out in the desert. It's an ultimate jinn relic. It's very powerful and could really turn tides, like, politically, and give the Sultan a lot of power. And Luli is very reluctant to do this initially, but she doesn't really have a choice. One of the Sultan's main missions is to hunt down and kill all jinn, and her best friend is a jinn, so she's feeling very conflicted in that regard. But yeah, I just thought the cast of characters in this were a lot of fun to read about. I liked their dynamics and how they evolved over the course of the novel. I feel like this first book felt a little, I don't want to say standard, but like very reminiscent of other things I've read before. It is sort of a retelling of 1001 Nights, but I do think the potential that the series has to go to really interesting places is very high. So I gave this 4 stars. I had a lot of fun reading it. It isn't anything like super unique, but it was well written and I really liked the characters, and that does a lot for me. So this was a lot of fun and I'm really excited for the sequel now. So I'm glad that I read this one. Then I picked up When We Were Friends by Holly Bourne. I don't think this had a very wide release in the US. This is by a British author and is set in the UK. It has a lot to do with the complexities of female friendship, specifically through the early 2000s, actually. That is a point that is brought up, is that it is very specific to this time period. And in this one, we follow two friends from when they meet as teenagers through a certain point in which they have this huge blowout argument and then they don't talk for like 10 years. And we also get that point in time where they reunite, and our main character is sort of skeptical and a little suspicious of this friend re-entering her life, but they did have this really strong emotional connection when they were teenagers, and so she's hopeful for a true reconciliation without any strings attached. But there is a lot of trauma in her past that is attached to this person. So we bounce back and forth in time and slowly kind of lead up to finding out what happened that broke these two friends apart when they were, I think, 19-ish, how that impacts their lives in the modern day when they're like in their 30s. And there was a lot going on in this book. I definitely enjoyed it. It was very readable, but it does handle some very dark themes, specifically with like sexual assault, and if you're sensitive to like drug use and alcohol abuse and stuff as well, like there's a lot of that in this novel. Just like reading about their friend dynamics, not just like between the two of them, but also in their larger group of friends as they become like older teens, was really difficult to read about. There's a sort of like conflicting feeling when they're teenagers, especially, of wanting and seeking male attention, but like basically being sexually assaulted and degraded, but like that giving them a sense of validation because, oh, they were the ones chosen to be sexually assaulted. And it's really messed up. But, like, as a former teenage girl, like, I kind of empathized with those moments. Like, I understood it. Like, that want for attention and validation, and unfortunately only receiving it in these really harmful ways, but, like, at least you're receiving it. So, it definitely deals with very heavy topics. Do not read this one lightly, but I did think it handled those heavy topics very well. So, for that reason, I give it 4 out of 5 stars. It's not my normal read, but I'm glad that I read it ultimately. Then I picked up Welltraveled by Jen DeLuca because I needed kind of a fluffy romance after When We Were Friends. This one is the 4th book in the Well Met series that kind of follows these romances surrounding a Renaissance fair. I just love this series so much. This one kind of felt the most removed from these core cast of characters that has carried this series. We follow Mitch's cousin, who is a lawyer. I'm forgetting her name, Lulu. She's very burnt out, and the previous summer she went to go see her cousin Mitch perform and had a lot of fun at this Renaissance fair. So she's, I think, on location for some work-related thing and decides to check out this fair, and just is receiving these unending calls and emails from her boss, and she just decides she's over it. Like, she's become a lawyer that she didn't want to be. She's not doing the work that she went to law school to do, and she's just over it. And she ends up checking her phone in basically like a barrel of water, and this sort of becomes fair gossip, and she becomes kind of like a fair celebrity, like, oh, you're a phone girl. But she doesn't really know what she's gonna do with her life now that she's quit her job and thrown her phone away and she's like off the grid. So she ends up running into Stacy, who's a character that we've met several times and who had her own book in this series. And Stacy invites her basically on the road with this band that she does like merch and stuff for, called the Dueling Kilts. And Stacy herself is with like the manager, but Lulu ends up kind of having a thing with the lead singer guitarist, whose name I also forget, Dax. It's Dax, who is a notorious playboy in the fair circuit. So she's on her guard around him because she knows that he's like not serious and she doesn't know what the heck she's doing with her life. But, you know, attraction will do what it will do. So this was a fun book. I do think this had a lot more of like a character focus on Lulu and like her personal journey. And the romance kind of felt like it took a back burner spot in like the plot, but if you're okay with that, I would still recommend this book. It wasn't my favorite in the series, but I do think it will resonate with a lot of readers. I think my best friend Stephanie specifically will really vibe with this book. So while I gave it 3 stars, I think it would probably be a 4 or 5-star read for her. It was a lot of fun. If you liked any of the other books in this series, I definitely recommend it. But yeah, it was 3 stars for me. Then I read Demon in the Wood by Leigh Bardugo and Danny Pendergast. This is a graphic novel adaptation, I believe, of a short story that has already been published about the Darkling and his origins. This takes place obviously in the Shadow and Bone universe, which I have yet to read the main series of that still, but I'm a fan of the show and I'm a fan of the Six of Crows duology. I should probably get around to that at some point. But I think the Darkling is such an interesting character, and this graphic novel rather, really highlights the things that I think are the most interesting about him. Like, he is objectively an evil person in the Shadow and Bone timeline, but like you read his backstory and you like kind of understand why he becomes the way that he becomes. Like, it's just it's gut-wrenching and it makes you feel empty, and it's hard to read about for sure. The way that the Grisha were treated in his lifetime, his early years especially, is objectively awful. So this book really explores that time when he's a young man before he becomes the Darkling and like the general of the Grisha army and stuff, and what that time was like for him and his mom. The artwork is gorgeous in this book. That can really be a make or break for me in a graphic novel, but I think this story got an excellent artwork treatment. This is a good standalone. Like, this stands on its own really well. Like, it helps, obviously, if you know about Grisha in the Shadow and Bone universe, but this is a really good one-off story. So I really enjoyed this, and I gave it 5 stars, and I felt really sad and empty at the end of it, which I feel like was the point, so. Then, because I needed a heavy dose of cuteness after that, I picked up Long Shadow, which is the 3rd and final book in the Regency Fairy Tales series by Olivia Atwater. I have loved every single one of these. They are so charming and delightful while also dealing with like real world issues. It's just such a fun marriage of the two. This obviously takes place in Regency England, and we follow Abigail Wilder, who is the adoptive daughter of Dora and Elias Wilder, who were the main couple in the first book, Half a Soul, which is still my favorite, but this one was also really good. Abigail is helping Elias, her dad, because she herself wants to become a magician, and she's trying to help him figure out the mystery about these young women who are dying very suddenly in their beds, and what Lord Longshadow, who is sort of like the Fae ruler of death, might have to do with it. Lord Longshadow's slaw, or like raven Fae, who carry souls from one world to the next, are also going missing, and there's just this really interesting mystery abound. So I really liked the mystery. And on the way, Abigail also runs into this young woman named Mercy, who appears to be a laundress at first, but is definitely more than she appears to be. And this was a really cute, like, LGBTQ historical romance, and I really liked the way that Olivia Atwater approached their relationship, and Abigail like realizing that she has feelings for another woman, and that like that was even a thing. It really goes to show sort of the way that things that like don't seem appropriate just weren't talked about in this time, especially. So yeah, I thought this was delightful. I really liked the romance, and the story as a whole was awesome. So I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Half a Soul, like I said, is still my favorite, but I think this is my second favorite in the series, and I don't want it to be over. Like, I want her to write 100 more stories set in this world, but alas, there are only 3. I also read some manga this month, which I have left for the end of this video, just in case manga is not your thing. You can go ahead and skip, or, you know, go to the next video, whatever. But I read volumes 3 through 6 of Kamisama Kiss, and I am now well and truly obsessed with this series. I have since gone and purchased the rest of them, and there are 25 total, so those have slowly been coming in the mail for me, and I'm very excited to delve into more of them. This series follows Nanami, who is a teenage girl who's really down on her luck. Her father was a gambler and is like really behind on bills and stuff. And at the beginning of the series, they get evicted from their apartment and he basically ditches her. So she's by herself when she comes across this mysterious dude who he himself has been away from home for a really long time, and he's trying to gather up the courage to go back. But when they run into each other, he's like, oh, well, you can go live in my home, like, for me, basically, and tell my loved ones that I say hi. And she's like, the heck? But she agrees and finds out that his home is a shrine and that he is a former Kamisama, which is a land god, and he basically ditched his shrine, I think, like 50 years prior, and that she is now the new Kamisama. And initially, the Shinshi of this shrine, Tomoe, who is a fox demon, is very reluctant to accept her as his new god, but together they go through these shenanigans and they end up working really well together, and he does vow to be her Shinshi. So I just love this series. It's so cute. It does kind of have what I think is an Inuyasha vibe, and I say that having not actually seen Inuyasha, but only like knowing about it through my best friend, who has also read this series and is telling me to wait and see. So Nanami eventually ends up developing feelings for Tomoe, who is very much like, I will not fall for a human woman, but he has a mysterious past in which he did fall for a human woman, and I don't know. I've only just dipped my toes into this series. Like I said, I've only read volumes 1 through 6 of 25, so I'm so excited to read more, and this has been a lot of fun. So highly recommend, especially if you like Fruits Basket or like just really cute sort of supernatural manga romances. This has been a lot of fun. And that wraps up my December reading, my last few books of 2022. Again, sorry this one's coming kind of late. I feel like I read some of these a while ago now. But yeah, I thank you guys so much for watching. Please feel free to like this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, comment down below if you've read any of these or if you want to read any of these. I'd love to talk about it with you. And as always, have a lovely day. Bye.